The cult of domesticity was a value system used in the 19th century in the United States and Great Britain. And so basically these value systems were 4 great points, which were piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. For piety, women were expected to be religious, and religion was supposed to be a part of their everyday lives. And as historian Barbara Welter says, if religion was so vital to a woman, irreligion was almost too awful to contemplate. Purity was something a woman was also expected to keep. She was expected to remain pure until she was married, and that was a really great virtue. Submission. Husbands were thought of to be brought by God to their wives. They were expected to do as the husband said, and with no questions asked. And domesticity. These women were expected to stay home, raise children, and build a nice nest for when their husband came home. 19th century scientific reasoning. Women were physically smaller, and men attributed size with dominance. Women had less physical stamina, and women menstruate, which is a reason they gave that doesn't really have any reason. But men also pleaded temporary insanity when women menstruated. Women had a delicate immune system. They had smaller skulls and brains, in which scientists during the 19th century attributed small brains with less intelligence. According to the phrenology, women had primitive brains, and phrenology was the study of bumps and curves on the skull.
The code of domesticity was influenced by the ideals of republican motherhood. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, an increase of rejection of women from the masculine sphere in business and politics resulted in women creating their own living spheres. Women would try to reconstruct the social spheres and would be seen more as pure and moral. It created popular culture among the women's sphere, and because it taught women about the modern fashion, it gave them recipes, it gave them sheet music, and even gave household hints, which are the equivalent of today's inside looks in modern magazines. Magazine editorial policy was very conservative in the Goldies Ladies book. It did not ever talk about the Civil War, but select ladies issues. The Goldies Lady book thought that educated women would lead the human race in the domestic sphere. The domestic sphere was the sphere that women were thought to have truly belonged in. The Goldies Ladies book consisted of substantial literary diet of American talent, such as Edgar Allan Poe, Alice B., Catherine Sedgwick. Alice B? He just put Alice B. Okay. Instead of other poems and fiction that clogged other women's magazines. Okay, so as feminist movement gained power, Goldies Ladies book gradually lost its impressive following until he sold it in 1877 to John Hill Sayes Hollenbeck. One famous contributor to the Ladies' Goldie book was Sarah Josepha Hale, who had an early education and augmented it with teaching. She married David Hale, who supported her continued education, so they started a literary club with a few friends. At the time of David's death in 1822, Sarah had 5 kids, and to support them, sold a book of poems and novels, both moderately successful. With money from the book and novel, she started editing American Ladies magazine in Boston. She focused on the education of women in their own domestic sphere. Goldie absorbed Sarah's magazine into Goldies Ladies book. Sarah moved to Philadelphia to edit, and they started a very successful editor-owner relationship that would last until 1877, when the magazine was sold.
Other influential writers included Catherine Esther Beecher and Thomas Brannigan. Brannigan's novel, The Excellency of the Female Character Vindicted, was released in 1828. He debated some of the most controversial topics of his time. In his book, he talks about the female intellect. He noticed that women often faced prejudices and were disregarded by men. Society of his time, he believed, degraded women. He is against the women who focus on the domestic lifestyle. He also fears that the female intellect is harmed by the degrading of womanhood by the lack of their rights. He is seen as an early activist for the women's rights movement. Beecher, another influential writer, wrote an influential and informative novel entitled The American Women's Home. Her novel is an instruction book and a guide to women who firmly believe in the cult of domesticity and the values it has to offer them. Not only did it become a popular book to read, but it influenced much of the popular culture during her time around the domestic sphere. Published in 1872, it was based off the Christian ethics and morale, although much of the reasoning involved scientific reasoning from their era. Beecher, in her novel, includes many images that explain how one should set up their homes and how the heart works, etc. Although their scientific reasoning seems very primitive, it shows the growing tolerance of scientific reasoning as opposed to reliance on the theistic explanation. The book talks about antidotes and how to care for the old, the servants, the young, brooms, domestic animals, and even how to handle social situations with the homeless and the vicious.
Religion or piety was the core of women's virtue, the source of her strength. Young men looking for a mate were cautioned to search first for piety, for if that were there, all else would follow. Religion belonged to women by divine right, a gift of God and nature. This peculiar susceptibility to religion was given to her for a reason. The vestigial flame of piety, lightened up by heaven in the breasts of women, would throw its beams into the naughty world of men. So would the candle power reach that the universe might be enlightened, improved, and harmonized by women, bringing the world back from its revolt and sin. The rise of industrialization and cities led to change in gender roles, so men and women's lives increasingly grew apart from one another. Once manufacturing left the home, and with the advent of larger department stores, wage work began to leave the home. This took place gradually over a period of 40 to 50 years. In rural areas, households remained more centered, with overlap still occurring. These changes led to the creation of separate spheres, as work took on greater gender meaning and segregation. Religion, education, morality, domestic skills, and culture began to overshadow women's economic functions. Women remained part of an integrated household throughout the South. The exception was some signs of separate seen in urban areas. In cities, labor and households were divided, thus separate spheres began to form. Thus, they did not move toward forming a sisterhood with other women until much later. Women began to form groups to aid other women, and these groups were formed primarily around churches. Women began to promote the idea of sisterhood, and the women's movement was well underway even before the abolitionist movement began. This expectation of domesticity from women came up again in the 1950s when television depicted families and working husbands and housewives. In a wrap, the cult of domesticity was the force opposing the antebellum reform. While in the antebellum reform, we saw the rise of feminists, whose main purpose was to get rid of the women's sphere. The cult of domesticity's goal was to strengthen and educate women in their sphere.
Submission to husbands was the woman's greatest treasure. Okay, they have two great treasures?
No, I can't do it. I can't.
No, you were doing it perfectly.
I'm being watched, though. I'm being watched. I can't.